For most of human history, we've told a simple story about the donkey. A stubborn, humble animal. A beast of burden. Background noise for the great migrations of people, cattle, sheep, and wheat. The donkey, when we thought about it at all, was the part that didn't change the story. It carried it. That story is now wrong. And the bones knew it before we did. In 2022, a team led by the geneticist Ludovic Orlando published a sweeping genomic study in the journal Science. They sequenced 207 modern donkeys and 31 ancient ones. They collected DNA from teeth and bones pulled out of archaeological sites stretching from the Horn of Africa to the deserts of Central Asia, from Roman-era farmsteads to Bronze Age trading posts. They built the largest family tree of the donkey ever assembled, and what it showed was not the small, quiet origin we had imagined. The donkey, it turns out, was domesticated once, in East Africa, around 7,000 years ago. Not in Mesopotamia. Not beside the early cities of the Tigris and Euphrates, where so many other things were being tamed. Not in a slow, accidental drift across the ancient Near East. The ancestor was the African wild ass, and the moment of contact happened in a specific region, in a specific climatic crisis, by a specific kind of person. That alone is a reversal. But it isn't the one that matters most. Buried inside the same dataset was a stranger finding. The genome doesn't just record where a species began. It records what happened to it afterward. And when Orlando's team looked at the DNA of donkeys from the Roman period, animals that lived 2,500 years after domestication, they found something unmistakable. The genetic diversity of the species had collapsed. Not gradually. Sharply. For most of those 7 millennia, donkeys had remained genetically rich. Multiple maternal lineages. Multiple wild populations folded into the domestic one. Then, sometime around the beginning of the Common Era, that variety narrowed, as if a great many family lines had been pruned at once. Something happened to the donkey. Something large-scale, deliberate, and historically loud. This is where the story changes shape. The accepted version, and it's worth pausing on what we accepted, was that the donkey spread quietly. That it trickled outward from its place of origin, carried by traders, war parties, and wandering herders. Useful, yes. Central, no. A footnote to the rise of the horse. A stand-in for the ox in dry country. Something you owned if you were poor. The new genomic evidence pushes against all of that. The bottleneck around the Roman era wasn't the signature of a passive animal drifting through history. It was the signature of an animal being deliberately bred. By someone. On a scale large enough to scrub diversity out of the entire species. Across continents. Think about what that implies. For most of the donkey's history with us, it had been treated as a tool of convenience. Then, in the centuries when Rome was building roads, ships, aqueducts, and grain empires, when Mediterranean agriculture was reorganizing around the demands of cities of 1 million people, the donkey became something else. It became a piece of industrial infrastructure. A standardized unit. The animal version of a manufactured part. And there is one more layer, and it is the one that makes this story stranger than it first appears. The DNA also shows that, although domestication began with the African wild ass, the modern donkey is not a clean descendant of one population. It carries echoes of at least one other wild lineage, Nubian, Somali, folded in early, then lost. The ancestors of every working donkey on Earth today trace back to a small, mixed founding pool in East Africa. Then they were carried, traded, gifted, marched, and bred across the ancient world. Their descendants pulled water in Egyptian fields, hauled silver from Spanish mines, carried olive oil across Roman roads, and moved caravans of incense out of southern Arabia. The animal most people dismiss as ordinary had become, by the Roman period, a node of global trade. The Romans needed donkeys because they needed movement. Movement of grain, of stone, of people, of armies. The donkey was the lever. It was the unit of logistics that didn't need feeding on barley the way a horse did. It lived on scrub. It drank when water was available. It could be bred in enormous numbers without arable land. And so they bred it. Enormously. The genomic collapse is the fingerprint of that breeding. A bottleneck is what it looks like when geneticists, decades later, trace the population history of a species back through time and find that, at one specific era, almost all the lineages they see in living animals converge into a narrow channel. It is not the shape of natural decline. It is the shape of human selection. Go back to the beginning for a moment, because the beginning explains why the bottleneck is so shocking. Orlando's team dated domestication to roughly 5000 BCE. The Sahara was drying. Pastoralists in what is now northern Africa and the Horn were losing grasslands. They were moving into new social arrangements, ones built on long-distance exchange, on moving wealth across terrain rather than holding it in fields. They needed a pack animal that could survive in arid country. The donkey was it. The first beast of burden built for an arid world. That origin already complicates the older story. The donkey was not domesticated in the Fertile Crescent alongside wheat, barley, goats, sheep, and cattle. It was domesticated in a different geography, under a different pressure, by a different kind of society, one responding to climate collapse rather than agricultural plenty. And it was domesticated later. The horse would not join it for another 3,000 years. So if the horse is the animal of the steppe, of war, of mounted speed, the donkey is the animal of the dust, of the caravan, of the slow patient labor that holds a trade network together across bad country. For a long time, that wasn't treated as important. Donkeys didn't have a glamorous archaeology. Their bones were everywhere and described as unremarkable. The people who studied them often assumed they had always been minor, that they were scavenged from the margins of grander histories. The ancient DNA tells a different story. It tells us that the donkey was a participant, not a bystander. It reshaped where people could live, where they could trade, what they could build. It had a founding event in Africa. It had a founding event again, in a sense, in the Roman era, when the species was reshaped for empire. 2 bottlenecks. 2 revolutions. 1 animal. Here is the part no one expected. Modern geneticists can now tell a Nubian wild ass from a Somali wild ass in ancient DNA, and they can see how each contributed to the founding of the domestic donkey. They can also see that, by the Roman period, that mix had been channeled through selection. The modern donkey is, in a meaningful sense, a Roman artifact as much as an African one. The shape of the animal that pulls a cart in North Africa today, that carries salt in the Sahel, that pulls plows in highland Peru, its genetic profile was largely set in the Iron and Horsan Empire centuries of the first millennium BCE. Look around a working landscape anywhere on Earth and the donkey is still there. It is the most widely distributed working animal on the planet after the dog. It pulls, carries, plows, fetches water, moves goods through markets. It is the animal of the small farmer, the long road, and the dry country. We treated it as a leftover. A symbol of the rural, the stubborn, the subordinate. A comedic creature from stories and fables. What the bones say is that the donkey was the partner in some of the largest economic reorganizations in human history. It didn't ride into battle. It hauled what battle required. It didn't plow empires into being. It carried what empires were made of. And it was built, twice, by human hands and human need. Once, in the drying Sahara, when a continent needed a new way to move. And once, in the Mediterranean, when a civilization needed a new way to feed its cities. 2 chapters of deep human history, written in the genome of one species. Both in the bones. If this kind of recovery matters to you, if you think ancient DNA is a way of finding human stories we almost lost, consider subscribing. It helps this work keep going. There is a habit in history of mistaking visibility for importance. We remember the animals painted in victory, carved into monuments, praised in poetry. The horse rears in bronze. The bull stands for strength. The lion becomes empire's metaphor. But the donkey rarely receives that treatment. It enters the record sideways, in account books, in supply lists, in burial goods, in the worn joints of excavated bones. It appears not where glory is staged, but where labor accumulates. And that may be the clearest sign of what it really was. Because infrastructure is almost never celebrated while it is working. Roads are taken for granted until they break. Granaries are invisible until they empty. Transport systems disappear into the background precisely when they are most effective. The donkey belonged to that category of power, the kind that becomes harder to see the more completely it remakes the world. A caravan arrives, a market grows, a quarry expands, a city eats for another year, and the animal that made those things possible leaves behind almost no myth equal to its labor. That is why the genomic evidence matters beyond zoology. It does not simply revise the biography of one domestic species. It exposes a larger mistake in the way we tell the human past. We have favored kings over carriers, battles over supply chains, monuments over maintenance. But civilizations are not built only by command. They are built by transport, repetition, endurance, by the ability to move matter across distance again and again at tolerable cost. The donkey was one of the great answers to that problem. And once you see that, the animal begins to reappear everywhere. In the rise of marginal farming zones. In the connection between dry hinterlands and urban markets. In the spread of metals, oils, textiles, salt, stone, and grain. In the daily mechanics of empire. Not dramatic enough to dominate the written chronicles, but indispensable enough to structure the world those chronicles describe. The donkey was not an accessory to expansion. It was one of expansion's conditions. There is something almost poetic in the fact that this could be recovered only now, through fragments of ancient DNA. The bones outlasted the assumptions built around them. For centuries, the donkey carried human economies while remaining intellectually sidelined, and then, long after the roads had cracked and the empires that bred it had fallen, its genome kept the ledger. It preserved the memory of origins in African drought, of movement across deserts and seas, of selection under Roman demand. The archive was inside the animal all along. So the donkey story is not small at all. It is a story about climate pressure, domestication, trade, standardization, and empire. It is a story about how human beings reshape life to solve material problems, and how those solutions, once scaled, can reorganize the planet beneath our notice. The humble animal at the roadside turns out to be one of history's quiet engineers. And perhaps that is the real correction. The donkey did not merely carry civilization. In ways we are only now learning to measure, it helped design where civilization could go.